We think women need to talk more openly about money because money really matters. It shouldn't be embarrassing or confusing. Join the conversation. We'll be discussing a whole range of topics which will help you get comfortable with your finances. Money Matters. Brought to you by AJ Bell. Hello and welcome back to the AJ Bell Money Matters podcast. I'm Danni and Laura's back. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Danni. Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm back. I am thankfully ditched the cold. Then I had a week's holiday, so that's quite a nice way to get over a cold. Unfortunately, you still sound ill, Danni. Like I think half of the nation is at the moment come down with this illness.
I do, and it's quite interesting because initially when I was doing radio stuff, the presenters would have to say, "Oh, you sound really poorly." And there was about 4 or 5 days when they stopped saying that, and now they've started saying that again. I just can't get rid of it.
Oh, no. It is the time of year, isn't it? It feels like the weather's changed, the clock's changed, and instantly everyone's got ill. But hopefully you get better soon. And actually, you know, less sympathetically, you need to get better soon because the budget is at the end of this month. And that is gearing up to be a very busy period for financial news and therefore also for us. So the budget is due on the 26th of November, so not that far away. And it's already been dominating headlines, hasn't it?
It has, and I'm quite annoyed by the date of the budget, but not quite as annoyed as a lot of retailers. But it's put the kibosh, I think, on my Black Friday shopping plans because I'm assuming that we're going to still be really busy after the budget, Thursday, Friday afterwards. And that means that potentially I can save less money in those lovely sales. But clearly, that's not something that the Chancellor had in mind when she was setting the date. And also, maybe it's a good thing, because unless you have ignored every news website, turned off the radio whenever the news comes on, and generally tried to hide under a rock, you must be aware that tax hikes look likely. I think that's the word for it. Look likely.
I think so. Feels like we're at the stage where we're just weighing up which tax hike is coming rather than whether any tax hikes are coming. And I know you and Charlene chatted a bit about 2 of the potential changes that the Chancellor might pull out of her big red box come budget day. But our one big thing for this episode had to be all about tax. So what taxes might go up, how those changes might impact you. So stay tuned, and I promise we will keep it as jargon-free as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard at the moment to keep it jargon-free because there's so much jargon around. We'll try and break some of that down for you, but we've also got a great guest interview this episode. Now, AJ Bell Money Matters is a campaign, of course, which is aimed at helping women understand and combat the gender investment gap. And we know that the gender pay gap plays a big part in that. So there were some figures out from the Office for National Statistics recently which showed over the past decade the gender pay gap has narrowed by 25%, which is a great figure. Now, there is still more work to do, but I think that is worth celebrating. And in the run-up to International Men's Day, we wanted to discuss the important role that men play in the fight for equality. So we're going to be hearing from Lee Chambers, the founder of Male Allies UK, and he's got some fascinating thoughts. And considering we've been talking about toxic masculinity, there's been a lot of discussions about, particularly in the United States, the rollback of those diversity and inclusion programs. It just seemed like a really timely discussion.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, the importance of men in this fight for more equality, or in our particular area, you know, fighting for closing that gender investment gap, it's absolutely crucial to have those people in the room, to have male allies, and, you know, even in the workplace, to have great male bosses and mentors in that space. So it's good that we've made an exception, but don't worry, we won't be letting too many men on this podcast, but it's definitely a good one to break our trend.
Yeah, we haven't had too many men on the podcast. In fact, I can think of only one other, and that was way back at the beginning. And I can't believe that we're actually celebrating 4 years of Money Matters.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? I think of the changes that we've seen over that time in terms of, on a personal level, the reach of our audience and the number of people that are listening to us and subscribing to us. But also, how the world has changed in that 4 years.
Yeah, it has changed a lot. It's quite scary to sort of think back, but also it's quite scary to think how the world is likely to change just over the next 6 months.
That's so true. And on that topic, let's get back to the budget, the much talked about budget. Let's talk tax, because as we record this at the start of November, most of the papers and news websites have at least one story, if not about a million, about potential tax changes that could be heading our way in the budget. In fact, I saw a headline just this morning that said the 100 different taxes that Rachel Reeves could change, which feels quite mad. But I think it would be good to do a bit of an explainer about what some of those taxes might be, how they impact you and how they actually work, because tax is a bit complicated. Dare I say it, Danny? Sometimes a little bit boring, but crucial because we all pay it. So you should really know what you're paying. So we'll focus mainly on the taxes paid by individuals rather than businesses, because that is our audience. So let's start with income tax. Everyone will have heard of this one. So this is paid by everyone who has an income. That's an important word, an income, not just a job. And you get a certain amount that you can earn each year where you don't pay income tax. So that's £12,570. Why they don't round it up and make our jobs easier, I don't know, but they don't. So that's the amount that you can earn before you have to pay any income tax. And then after that, you will pay income tax at 20%, also known as basic rate income tax, up to where you earn just over £50,000. Then you pay higher rate. And then after that, you pay additional rates. So those are 3 different rates of income tax that you pay. And that just goes into the general government spending. So think of all those things that the government spend money on, the NHS, education, defence, transport, all of those, that goes into that pot. So that is income tax, but it isn't just on your salary. So it's on pensions, on rental income, on savings interest above a certain threshold. You'll also pay a version of income tax on dividends, but it's at different rates and different rates there. So that's specifically called dividend tax, and we won't get into that. But so it's on all manner of different income, not just on people who have salaried jobs. The next tax that lots of people pay, but not everyone, is national insurance. So this is paid by employees and employers and self-employed people. Previously, people saw this as kind of ring-fenced for state benefits like the state pension. The reality is that all of this goes into one big tax pot that the government spends. There's no specific ring fencing of national insurance contributions, but that's typically how people see it, is kind of these national insurance contributions are paying towards their state pension entitlement. And there is still some truth to that. You have to have a certain number of qualifying years of paying national insurance, 35 qualifying years of paying national insurance to get your full state pension. So there is still a link there. But the reality is it's just another tax that goes into the big old pot of money that the government has to spend. The rates with national insurance are a bit complicated. And there's also been quite a few changes over the years. So I won't go into all of those rates because people will probably fall asleep and we'll be here for a while. But if you want to know exactly what you do pay, the government website is actually quite good. So if you go on gov.uk and look at national insurance rates, if that's how you want to spend your spare time, no judgment from me. And you can see exactly what you'll be paying depending on your income and your employment situation. But crucially, you don't pay national insurance once you've reached state pension age. So I said at the top that most people pay national insurance, but not everyone. So it's a tax that only those under this age pay. So that's come under some criticism in the past because you could have 2 people working in the same business in exactly the same job, earning exactly the same amount of money, and one is paying less tax than the other if one of them was over state pension age and one of them was under it. But it's because of that previous that tie in with the state pension, and the logic that you shouldn't be contributing towards your state pension if you're already claiming your state pension. So that's originally why it's in there. So those are kind of the big taxes that you pay on your income.
See, I'm learning a lot from you today, Laura, most notably the fact that I think you possibly do spend quite a lot of time looking at these tax issues on the government website.
Do you think I'm their most frequent visitor? That's quite a sad state of affairs, isn't it? I should get out more.
You should get rewards points for it. That's what I think. Those are the big two. What you said a little while ago about the 100 taxes that you should be thinking about, that terrified me because there are so many different taxes. And don't worry, we are not going to go through them all, as much as I think Laura possibly knows all of them because of the time that she spends on that aforementioned website. But I am going to wrap up a couple of others. So VAT, value added tax, that is charged at 3 different rates. So you pay 20% on top of most of the goods and services that you buy. You've then got 5%, which is the reduced rate. So if you think about things like domestic fuel, children's seats, mobility aids, and also then you've got 0%. That's the zero rate. Now, that's for things like children's clothing, children's shoes. If you are lucky enough to have small feet like myself, you can still buy children's shoes and not be charged VAT. That's a little hack for you. Also, things like food, essentials, milk, eggs, fruit, but luxuries like chocolate bars and, crucially, chocolate-covered biscuits, they are subject to VAT. Food eaten in the restaurants and takeaways as well, all charged at 20%. Businesses then pay VAT to HMRC. Again, that is complicated. I'm not going to go into the business side of it, but I will say that VAT changes can impact inflation. And we've spoken so much about how inflation has really taken a bit of a squeeze on all of our budgets. There are a host of others to think about: council tax, stamp duty, vehicle taxes like road tax, fuel duty, capital gains tax, dividend tax, inheritance tax. I think that's possibly covered most of the biggies, except there is one that gets a lot of coverage. It's not technically a tax, but it gets referred to a lot as the stealth tax, Laura.
Yeah, so this isn't like a separate line item on that list of taxes, but this is where the government increases taxes, but by stealth rather than explicitly increasing, the headline rate that you pay. And so this has been in the news over the past few years because we've had a freeze on tax bands. Yeah, so this isn't like another explicit tax like income tax, for example, but it is where the government increases tax, but by stealth rather than explicitly doing it through raising headline tax rates. This has been in the news a lot over recent years because it's happened on income tax. So what happened here is they've frozen the bands for income tax. Typically, they would increase each year by inflation. So at the top of the podcast, when I was talking about income tax, I talked about the amount that you can earn tax-free, so that £12,570. And the reason that's such an exact amount of money is because it's been increased by inflation each year, so that as you get a pay rise, you don't necessarily get pushed into a next tax band. That happens for the higher rate threshold as well. But what has happened since 2021 is that those rates have been frozen. So rather than increasing by a little bit each year, or what would have been quite a lot during that period when we had very high inflation, they've been frozen at the place that they are. And that is going to continue and won't end until 2028. So one of the things that's up for grabs at the budget that lots of people seem to think might happen or is very likely to happen is extending that freeze. So taking it beyond 2028 and extending it to 2030 potentially, or even longer. What's interesting to note here is that this was a Conservative tax policy. So the Tories brought this in originally, this freeze. It saves them money because it means that they're taking in more in tax revenue. But it's not as explicit or easy to explain to people as just saying, okay, well, we're putting up tax rates, or you're going to pay X amount more tax each year. So it's a sneaky little tax. And so and Labour continued it when they came into power. They did have the option that they could have said, no, we're going to end it early and stop this stealth tax. But they said that they would continue the previous Conservative policy, which kept it until 2028. And then what the speculation is now that we'll just take that policy and keep on running with it. It's quite a smart one for the government in a way. It raises a pretty chunky amount of money, but it's not easy to explain to people. You can't explicitly say to them, it's cost you this amount of money. So you can see why politically they might want to keep it, even if all of us don't really want them to.
No, and it's quite interesting because at the last budget, Rachel Reeves did stand up and point to this stealth tax, this freeze, and say that she was going to abolish the freeze. So it would end at 2028. But clearly the sums have changed so much that it looks like she's in a really difficult position. And one of the things that she's now talking about doing is actually increasing income tax, something which the Labour government said, hand on heart, manifesto pledge that they would not put up national insurance on, crucially, working people. They wouldn't increase income tax and they wouldn't increase VAT. But the sums look quite nasty. I certainly wouldn't want to have those sums in my own household budget. And it looks like an income tax increase could be on the cards, Laura.
I'd worry for your household budget if it had a 30 billion black hole in it. I'd have some questions, I think, about how you'd got to that situation without spotting it. But that is what Rachel Reeves and the government is looking down the barrel of is, there's varying estimates, but it's a huge shortfall that they've got, and they've got to plug it somehow. And clearly tax rises is one of them. And what better tax rise than a tax that's paid by the majority of people, which is income tax. So there are rumours that they could potentially look at changing the rate of income tax, so increasing the amount of income tax we pay. So one of the potential changes could be increasing the basic rate of income tax by 1 percentage point. So taking it from 20% up to 21%. It would cost taxpayers up to £377 a year in extra tax. So anyone who earns just over £50,000 would face the biggest hit. And then it's kind of capped at that because you're just changing basic rate tax in this example. It only affects you up to a limited amount. So that £380 a year extra in tax roughly. And based on HMRC's own figures, that would raise the government about £7 billion in the next tax year and just over £23 billion over the next 3 years. So that kind of brings to life just how much money they could make from doing that. But there is an alternative option, the so-called two up, two down, which I quite like for its little catchy moniker. So this is where the government makes a change to income tax and national insurance. So those two big taxes that we talked about earlier that are paid by people on their income, but have slightly different criteria to them. So the logic here is that you could have a 2 percentage point increase in income tax. So take basic rate tax from 20% to 22%, for example, and then give an equivalent reduction in national insurance rates. So cut down national insurance rates. So at that band, national insurance is charged at 8%, bring that down to 6%. So for workers, that would be cost neutral. You're paying more in one tax, but you're paying less in the other, and the move cancels each other out. If the same move was made for self-employed people, because they pay slightly different national insurance at a different rate, but if the same change was made, then it would be cost neutral for them as well. But crucially, pensioners would be hit harder. So as we talked about earlier, they don't pay national insurance. So once you're over state pension age, you don't pay national insurance. So they wouldn't benefit from the cut to national insurance. All they would see is the hike to income tax rates. And so they would potentially be hit by that harder, and that would cost them money. So how much money, I hear you cry, Danny? Well, in that move, a
I did.
pensioner,
I did.
I knew you were, a pensioner with £35,000 of income would pay about £450 a year more tax. So a not inconsiderable amount of money. If they were on £45,000 a year, they'd pay £650 a year more tax. So pretty chunky. You can see partly the logic. The government has talked before about wanting to simplify the tax system because, as I talked about earlier, national insurance just goes into the big mega pot of government money with income tax. There's an appetite from some groups to ultimately abolish national insurance and just roll it all into income tax. Then you have one tax rate. It's much easier for people to understand and it's a much simpler system. But of course, with this change, that does hit pensioners, and that is a crucial kind of older vote that's often talked about for governments and when it comes to their popularity and, the next general election.
When you talk about a 30 billion pound black hole, sometimes my household budget does feel like it has a deficit that size, a big black hole that size, particularly when both kids are on half term or something and they go into the fridge and they're like, where's the food? It's not a sum that most of us can really get our heads around, but it is a sum that Rachel Reeves clearly is having to contend with. And there have been an awful lot of different figures that I've seen put on the potential size of this black hole. Some people saying 30 billion, some people saying 40 billion. I've even seen some as high as 50 billion. I think at the moment, we're waiting for a lot of the sums to be put in front of us. Now, one of the big changes has been a downgrade to what's called the productivity forecast. So this is a measure of how much we all produce per hour. So the amount of stuff that we make and do and how that impacts the economy. And the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is the government spending watchdog, has been actually quite optimistic with its forecasts when you compare it to other organisations like the Bank of England. And they are intending, we understand, they have given the bit of paper to the Treasury now to downgrade their forecast, to bring that forecast into line more with the Bank of England, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which would then mean that for each percentage point, 0.1 percentage point, that the productivity is downgraded, it's been estimated that the Institute for Fiscal Studies actually said it would cost about £7 billion. And the figure that you may have seen put on that is 0.3%, which potentially gives Rachel Reeves a £21 billion bigger black hole than she thought that she would have to fill. Now, some of that is likely to be offset because we're expecting an upgrade to wage growth, but she's also got an almighty issue to deal with the headroom. Now, this is a bonkers term, which kind of is the breathing space that she's got, just in case anything awful happens and suddenly she needs to find a ton of extra cash. So, for example, a couple of years ago, we had obviously the situation where energy bills were going through the roof. The government stepped in, helped out with the energy bills. If something like that were to happen, the government needs to give itself a sort of buffer, and that's called the headroom. And if that headroom is too small and too many things happen, then it means that every year you've got to go back and revisit that buffer. You've got to sort of top it back up again. And Rachel Reeves has said that she doesn't want to have to keep doing that because, frankly, we don't want to have to keep talking about the fact that taxes might have to go up again in the next budget. So that does mean that she is going to have to look to raise a little bit more there. We've also had a couple of U-turns on cuts to things that they were hoping to bring in. Of course, we had the U-turn on the winter fuel allowance. There have been a lot of U-turns on things like welfare. So some of the savings that they'd hoped to make haven't been made. And that does mean that when Rachel Reeves gets to her feet with that iconic red box, that she is going to have to work some serious mathematic acrobatics in order to make things work. And I am delighted that we don't have to sit down and do those mathematical acrobatics until after she's sat down again.
I was asked on a podcast recently what I would do if I was given the Chancellor job. So I was in Rachel Reeves' position, and I said I would instantly quit, because I do not envy the position that you've just laid out there of, you've got this financial issue, you've got to plug this hole, but you've also made a certain number of promises during your general election manifesto to a certain number of people. You can't alienate the entire nation by hiking everyone's taxes. Feels like a pretty impossible task to me, so I don't envy her.
No, I don't envy her. And of course, there will be always some people who are disappointed. There'll be some people that feel that they're more hard done by than others. There will be some people who will be saying, why are you spending money on this? You should be spending money on this. Why are you taxing that? You should be taxing this instead. So I think it's a bit of a thankless task. But if you have questions about the budget, do please get in touch with us. You can do it the usual means. You can reach us on social media. Just look for us at AJ Bell Money Matters. We're on Instagram. You can also get in touch with us, hello@ajbellmoneymatters.co.uk, if you want to drop us an email. And if you've just got general questions about what's going on in the economy, why we're where we are, what things like GDP, gross domestic product, mean, health check for the economy, then go back a couple of episodes, because we had a great sort of economics 101, which will really give you a sort of foundation of some of the things which are being and will be discussed between now and, well, probably the end of time.
And some of these things, we're aware, do get a bit technical, do get a bit jargony. We think that we do it in a very accessible way. Hopefully you guys agree, but it's really important to engage with this stuff. It's important to work out what these tax changes, when they're announced, will mean for you. And it's all part of kind of engaging with your finances, and ultimately closing that gender investment gap is engaging with money, engaging with how it impacts you and your disposable income, and then what you can do with that money. So it's worth persevering through the jargon, I guess is my point. And to that end, while the pod is obviously aimed at women, run by women, mostly features women, and celebrates women, we know that men have a massive part to play in the battle to reduce the gender investment gap. Whether it's our personal relationships, our work relationships, they have a massive impact on our lives and our finances. And equality and inclusion can't happen without the support of male allies. So in the run-up to International Men's Day, we caught up with Lee Chambers, who's the founder of Male Allies UK, which was set up to promote gender equality. And it focuses on engaging men in conversations about gender equality and inclusion. It's a really interesting discussion, this one, about some of the issues being faced at the moment, with a pullback, particularly in the US, on diversity and inclusion programs, and also about what it's like to be the only man in the room.
So, Lee, thank you so much for joining us on the AJ Bell Money Matters podcast. I guess the first thing to start with really is, what is a male ally? I can see the sign behind you. What is one?
So a male ally it's a really interesting question, to be honest, Danny. On the surface, it's kind of referenced as a man who steps into gender equality, who's willing to partner with women to accelerate change, one who's willing to step up and challenge and intervene should there be things such as sexist jokes or people being harassed. A man who's willing to step to the side and partner with women to accelerate that change, to sponsor, to mentor, and to really think about doing that to a whole wide range of people. And men who also know how to step back and yield the space, let other people be able to showcase their skills, provide resources to ensure we're able to make workplaces where barriers are reduced for everyone, and also to go on a journey of self-discovery, because one of the biggest parts of being a male ally is actually men developing themselves, getting closer and more understanding of other men's journeys, and actually working to become the whole men that they are rather than the man that society has told them to be.
So it's really interesting because we've done quite a lot on female role models and the need for them, and on female mentoring and networking and that kind of thing. But having a male ally, having relationships with men is really important in terms of helping further diversity and inclusion.
So I think really working across gender is incredibly powerful. I think sometimes we don't realize just how powerful the differences that we have are when we bring them together, and those differences are listened to and heard. I think we have to consider that we've still got in society today a bit of an imbalance in certain areas. Women have made a lot of progress in terms of financial freedom and leadership in comparison to 50 years ago. Obviously, some other aspects of women's lives have not accelerated and changed and evolved at the same pace. But I think for men, we've also had challenges around our shifting role within society, some of the different challenges that we're starting to face as the world has changed. And I think one of the most powerful things is when men and women work together, it stops us blaming each other, because there is a little bit of that gender war narrative in society at the minute that women's progress is the reason why men are struggling. And it's simply not true. One of the reasons why men are struggling is because of how the world has changed, because of how systems can actually be quite damaging for men, and also how if we don't work together and get curious together, we actually don't realize how we can tackle some of those challenges, because men's and women's challenges are often very interrelated and interconnected. And we actually, if we come together, we both have the tools to start to tackle them. And the truth is still to this day that a small group of men in this country has a lot of institutional power to make change, and men have different toolkits. So that's why it's so important for men and women to come together.
Now, you and I met at an International Women's Day event with SmartWorks, which is our charity partner. And I knew when I was putting together a list of questions, chances are I was just going to chuck them all out and completely rewrite what I was going to ask. And what you were just saying there about men and some of the challenges that we face at the moment in terms of DE&I and the shift in narrative, some of that's associated with toxic masculinity. How does all of that play in this debate about gender equality?
There are some online voices that are really unhelpful, that are shaping narratives. They've got big platforms and they don't actually really care about the people that they're speaking to, because they see them as a commodity. They can manipulate them into certain beliefs and certain perspectives, which then allow them to be easier to be sold to. So much of what we actually see is based from a hyper capitalistic perspective of getting people to believe certain things. And we do live in an algorithmically driven world where people are very, very quickly shoehorned into other people who have very similar beliefs. Because if we can bring those together as a community, then that ultimately means that we can shift their beliefs, because they're all in a very, very similar place, usually very disenfranchised, quite disappointed that the way they expected the world to be hasn't turned out the way that they expected. And there's a lot of men who still feel a lot of pressure to be a provider, even though we're in a world where last year we moved from the most common working setup in a partnership being one full-time, one part-time. Last year, and as of last year, the most common partnership way of working now in a couple in the UK is actually both working full-time. So we're in a space where it's not this idea that very few people can be that individual provider. And what we do with men is actually say, don't lose that desire to provide, but you're not the provider, as in the only one. You can actually be a provider, and you can be a provider financially, emotionally, supportively, through partnership, through, caregiving. Be a provider of lots of things rather than putting yourself under so much pressure to be a provider of finance in a world where most partnerships require two incomes for a stable and sustainable way of living.
It's fascinating because we've done a piece of research which is on our website, which looks at women's financial wobbly bits and the impact of their very different life journey to a man's life journey being one of the reasons that we have a gender pension gap, a gender investment gap. But what you were just talking about there about having two providers working for a common goal, that's something which will benefit both men's finances and their emotional well-being and women's finances.
I think we have to be honest and still look to this day at those wobbly bits around maternity, around menopause, around those things that men don't directly go through, but there's an indirect impact. We've still got a significant motherhood penalty in this country. I took time as a stay-at-home dad and realised just how undervalued caregiving was. Just the sheer amount of mental load from looking after two little ones, and just sat there with mothers and grandmothers in my local baby and toddler group and just heard stories that made me think, wow, I'd not even really considered or noticed that before. And that was incredibly powerful from my own perspective. And is one of the reasons that's inspired me into the very work that I do to this day. But the truth is, as a society, we should be looking, how can we close those gaps? Because the reality is that people fall into those gaps. The people who we love, the people who we care about. And when people fall into gaps, it doesn't just impact the person who fell in, it impacts their whole ecosystem around them. And if we can actively work to close some of those gaps, it allows us to build bridges between each other. And I think in a society that's becoming quite divided and polarized at times, an ability to build a bridge over some of those gaps is the way we're going to actually, work on supporting each other, work on getting that bit closer, and actually feeling like we can actually connect and have something and somewhere where we belong. So yeah, that's why I'm passionate about this work.
I wanted to ask you about how you got started, because I know that quite a lot of time you were the only man in a room. And we speak quite a lot about being the only woman in the room and how that has changed over time. But there are still occasions. But that must have been A, incredibly daunting at times, B, incredibly rewarding at times, and C, incredibly enlightening all the time.
Yeah. So I mean, my kind of pathway into it had started a little bit before that. I'd, started life in finance and got made redundant in the 2008 recession. I then built a tech business that started as from an e-commerce perspective, and gradually we built out a software arm of that as well. But a year before deciding I was going to become a stay-at-home dad, I actually become ill and my immune system had failed and I'd lost the ability to walk. So I had to learn to re-walk again over the course of 11 months, which was a real journey, especially given all of a sudden losing your mobility and your independence pretty much overnight is a big, big shock to the system. I was 29. It definitely gave me a lot of time to reflect on the things I'd taken for granted. It made me reflect on the difference that I was making in society. And it also made me think about my own masculinity and what I valued. Because very quickly, some of the things that I valued, such as status, physical presence, mobility, self reliance, I was being washed in the shower by nurses and healthcare assistants were helping me eat. Like all of a sudden, some of those things I valued were stripped away. And it did make me think, who am I with all this stuff removed? So it was a very reflective period, as well as a very difficult period. And I learned to walk again alongside my daughter, who was born when I was in walking rehab. And I was determined to get back on my feet so I could take her first steps with her and manage to, get back on my feet to be able to do that. And I kind of laugh because I beat her to walking, but she's now 11 and I've not beat her much else since. But that was the passion where I started to think about what I could do. And there was an expectation I'd go back into my business and lead on our North American expansion. And I just didn't want to do that. So that's when I decided to become a stay-at-home dad. And wow, yeah, it kind of opened my eyes. It was the most effective leadership and development training course I've ever been on. That time, that time with two toddlers, oh boy, do you suddenly learn how to negotiate and communicate succinctly and be really, really present and really, really patient as well. But it was just spending time with those mothers and grandmothers. When I walked in, I felt like I wanted to walk out. It was uncomfortable. My background being finance tech, one of three brothers involved in sport. I had a very male dominant kind of upbringing. And yeah, if they hadn't have already run in and started playing with toys, and the fact they've got two pairs of legs and you only got one, I'd have probably tried to walk back out again because that discomfort was real. But there's a bit of courage that's required to just step into those spaces that weren't necessarily made with you in mind or didn't feel like places where you belonged. For me, being in that room was really powerful because I was listening to those, week after week and just gradually building a different perspective on the world and they were, open and trusted me enough to actually share some of these things. And some of these things did involve finances and childcare and how they've been treated in the workplace and discrimination by society and harassment out in society. And it just really made me consider the experiences that I wasn't living, what I wasn't seeing, and it made me think, what else am I not seeing? And that got me curious, because once you start to see these inequalities, you can't unsee them. And once you start to see them, you see other ones kind of popping up here and there. And obviously, you've done so much work on that pension and investment gap and how society's influences shape that from such a young age. And then the kind of the profiles around how we express our own risk. And yeah, it's just fascinating to consider how society impacts our actions and then how those actions then impact our opportunity. Because obviously, when it comes to financial gaps, finance gives opportunity, finance gives a level of power and choice and autonomy. And the truth is, where autonomy is restricted, that's when so many of society's challenges happen. Because even today, men are starting to feel their autonomy being restricted by how the world is. And that causes definite challenges for certain men who we speak to, because they feel that they can't fulfill what their father or grandfather did in life or what they expected as they grew up. And there's almost an element of like a patriarchal promise. If you be a good man and follow all the rules of being a man, then you will be rewarded with a level of freedom and a level of wealth and a level of success. And, systems don't tend to keep promises, Danny. So yeah, I think there's so much to be said around this, but also I think if I think about some of the men that I work with, we create a space where men can come and share what they think about inclusion without judgment. The only ground rule is that you're respectful. And what's really interesting is they have lots of perspectives that they've kind of taken or heard from communications that maybe haven't been comms that well, things that they've heard from people around them. And some of them are quite resistant to all these ideas around diversity and inclusion being a positive driver of change and a good thing. What's really fascinating is if you let them kind of go and talk about it, they're expecting to be judged. They've almost been told that you're going to be judged because you've got these views, because you've got these beliefs. If you just don't judge them, they express themselves and get to a point where they reflect and start to listen to themselves. And they realize they're being listened to and they're not being judged. And they suddenly feel a bit more heard and a bit validated. And then they kind of get towards the end of their unhappiness and actually start to share what's going on for them in their own life. And whether it's, challenges around, quite often around finances, around that provider mentality and not being able to fulfill it and struggling, 86% of men said that if they were going through financial challenges, it would impact their feeling of their own manhood. So we've still got a long way to go in breaking some of that. But, these men start to talk about everything: fertility challenges, struggling with their own mental health, not feeling like they've got the skills they need to, navigate emotional conversations, divorce, quite often just navigating life's administration and the challenges around that. And suddenly these men start to open up and share that they're going through things in their own lives. And that is kind of the source of why they're actually feeling quite resistant towards all these things changing. For some men, it's ageism suddenly hits them like a brick after not really having had much friction in their careers and their lives. So there is so many things going on. And I think if we boil it all down to everyone's beliefs come from somewhere, can we work with curiosity to understand where they started and where they come from? And most of the point, realize that everyone is going through some level of challenge in society. Very, very few people are immune to that. And if we can start with people's challenges and how we can work together to tackle them, we've got a shared goal, a shared narrative, something we can do together. And we say allyship is a skill set to build. It's not an ideology to believe. And working across difference will be a pivotal skill in, the technological evolution that we're moving through. When times are like they are for many organizations now, where economically it's squeezed, socially it's very volatile, and politically it's quite divided, working across difference, an ability to see different perspectives, and an ability to listen more effectively and to really think about how you bring more voices through is a skill set that's going to be a competitive advantage for those that are building it.
So Lee Chambers there, and it was great to get a different perspective on some of the conversations that we've been having over the past 4 years that Money Matters has been going.
I know, and I'm disappointed that you didn't bring cake, Laura. I know we couldn't have shared the cake, but I could have, thought about eating cake.
I do have leftover birthday cake downstairs from my friend's birthday, so I don't think it's going to make you any happier if I just go down and eat cake by myself after this. That's not really what you're looking for, is it? You want cake.
No.
I'll see if I can post some
cake.
to you.
Thank you. But I can't believe 4 years. 4 years.
I know, 4 years. It's an amazing achievement, but also we're still as keen to hear from you as we were 4 years ago. So get in touch with us. We're on social media. You can check out our website at ajbellmoneymatters.co.uk, and you can get in touch with us via email. Now, after 4 years, you think that I would remember what the email is off by heart, but I don't, Danny. So what is the email?
hello@ajbellmoneymatters.co.uk.
It's so simple. How have I not learned it in 4 years?
It's okay, because we got to the best bit now. This is the bit you like.
Confession time. Yes. Did Lee share a confession?
He did, and I'm really pleased that I managed to get his confession, because my confession is I keep forgetting to ask people to give me their confessions. But we did get one from Lee, and it was interesting because we're talking about going back years and years with our Money Matters campaign. Well, I do remember a very similar confession coming up way back at the start of Money Matters.
So for me, I think a financial faux pas in my journey. So when I was running my prior business in the technology space, I had a compulsive moment where I actually bought a significant amount of stock. And because of the volatility of that stock, by the time it was delivered, I'd lost 5 figures in the value of the stock. And I remember as a young person, early on in my business, really kind of give myself a really good kicking for being so impulsive and not mitigating that risk. What I will say is that did spawn part of our software business, was actually how we helped other vendors mitigate that risk. So possibly one of our biggest business mistakes became part of our business growth. So I think one of the biggest things and biggest piece of advice for me is that sometimes the errors, the challenges, and the things that don't go right on your financial journey can potentially be the biggest lesson about how you build wealth more effectively in the future. So don't hide behind the failure and think, why did I do that? And just use your emotions to block the treasure of the lesson of learning. Because in every financial challenge that you've been through, there's a lesson to take forward for the future.
Who had this similar confession?
So this was the boss of Colenio. Do you remember we were talking about dry January? Yes. Worth going back and having a listen to that one, yeah.
Common thing then to kind of get carried away and overconfident.
Or just make a mistake, because she'd made a mistake. She'd thought that she was buying something like 1,000 of something, and it turned out that each box had 10,000 of something. So she was stuck with a lot of labels.
That is a lot. But that is everything for this episode. We are going to be looking at side hustles next time. So how to make money from stuff you don't wear and other really useful tips.
I just learned from my kids, it has to be said. But I'm looking forward to this one. That is it, as Laura said. Thanks so much for listening.
Before you go, please remember this podcast is for educational purposes, and the views expressed don't necessarily reflect those of AJ Bell. The podcast isn't telling you if a certain investment is suitable or not. Don't forget that the value of investments can change, and you can lose money as well as make it. It's also important to remember that how you're taxed will depend on your individual circumstances, and rules can change. The way an investment performed in the past may not be the same as how it behaves in the future. If you want help, go see a qualified financial advisor.